Well, good evening and welcome to our quarterly speaker series. We are thrilled to have Dr. Mark Brocker with us this evening. I'm going to try to bob and weave through some of this biographical information so that it's not too lengthy, but it does highlight who Mark is, what he's done. Mark has served as a ELCA pastor from 1985 to 2022 when he retired from St. Andrew Lutheran Church in Beaverton, Oregon. He received his BA in philosophy from Pacific Lutheran University in 79, his MDiv from Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago in 85, and his PhD from theology from University of Chicago Divinity School in 96. He has served on and I don't want to miss this one at all, the Bonhoeffer um, Literary Society English Language, and has for 25 years was involved with the Dietrich Bonhoeffer works, specifically volumes 16, 11, and 14. Um, and he's retired and theologian in residence at is that St. Andrews
St.
Lutheran?
Luke.
Saint
St. Luke.
you're at St. Luke's in Portland. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
He and his wife Donna, married since 1977, and have six children and five grandchildren. The youngest three children were war orphans from West Africa, adopted into their family, and he does actually enjoy doing things besides Dietrich Bonhoeffer, reading, watching sports. I totally agree. The hiking, cross-country skiing, and fly fishing. I could fly fish with you, Mark, but I'm not going to do this other physical activity that makes me like get in shape and work too much. Um, I will confess that he is also a Packer fan, but for some reason he supports another baseball team other than I do. So we'll forgive him for that. But with no further ado, I'm going to call on Mark.
Well, thank you, Wes. Appreciate the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to Wes and all of you for to present on Bonhoeffer. To look especially to look. Bonhoeffer was somebody who was trying to find his way through in a very difficult time, and obviously there's some parallels with his time. There's some differences too, but certainly I suspect that most, if not all of us, can relate to that. Trying to find our way through and discern how to resist if need be in a very challenging, difficult time. And so we share that with Bonhoeffer. I connected with the Theology and Peace group through the text study led by Paul Nuchterlein. Paul and I went to seminary together, the Lutheran School of Theology, and we shared a love of theology and baseball, and both of us ended up adopting Liberian children. So there's a family connection in that way. So some of the face I recognized as he came on, Wes and Karen, and also I think I saw Tim and Mark that I've met through that text study, which I've very much appreciated participating in. The initial focus I had suggested as a possibility to Wes was the title I saw lifted up in a couple of the emails on the political responsibility of the church. In a sense, we're still dealing with that, but more specifically, I want to take a look at Bonhoeffer. Here's somebody who looked for so-called peaceful or nonviolent ways to resist, and then, in the end, ends up getting involved in a violent conspiracy. And so try to track what's going on there. And so I'm addressing that question as well as then I think we'll be able to learn things about how we may be being called to resist in a difficult time and how the church may be called to resist. You do have the outline. Again, use it as you will. I tend to follow an outline like this when I speak, and so if it's helpful to you, great. And if not, just you can have it there and use it when you will, and take notes on it and so on if that's helpful to you. So I want to start with what I call a Quaker critique. So the first I taught for a number of years. I would teach, because I was a full-time pastor, but I would teach a week-long Bonhoeffer seminar at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in Berkeley, and it was part of the Graduate Theological Union Intersession. And the very first one I did was called Bonhoeffer, Conspiracy and Imprisonment. We were working on volume 16, which is Conspiracy and Imprisonment in the translation project. Wasn't finished, but we were able to use some of the manuscripts that we were working from for that class. So it was fun for me to teach with, but also I think for the students to be looking at the stuff that we were working on at that very time. Uh, we had 24 students in that class. 8 of them were Lutheran, and the rest were from a variety of traditions. 3 of them were from a Quaker tradition. So at the end of the uh, final hour of the seminar, and we met 4 hours each day for a week. And the last thing we did in the final hour, and it's something I continued to do thereafter in these seminars, each student had a chance to share one insight or contribution that they had gained during the week that stood out for them in terms of Bonhoeffer's life and writings. Uh, and then they could raise one critique or question that they were still wrestling with with Bonhoeffer. And they had to keep it very short because you had 24 students to get through to do this. When it came time, all 3 Quaker students, they appreciated in one way or other just Bonhoeffer's faith, his conviction, his living out as a follower of Jesus, that they very much appreciated that. But all 3 of them said, we just can't go there with him in terms of his involvement in a violent conspiracy. That was a step too far for them. And it's been a long time, but I remember one of them said something to the effect like he's taking too much responsibility for history by being involved in a violent conspiracy. That was something along those lines is what they said. Bonhoeffer's first, in terms of pacifism, he wasn't necessarily raised in a family that were advocates of pacifism, but he had a year of postgraduate study at Union Seminary from 1930 to 31. So he was born in 1906, so he was in his early to mid 20s. He became friends while he was at Union Seminary with another postgraduate student from France, a guy named Jean Lasserre, who was a French Reformed theologian, pastor, and pacifist. And the 2 of them got to know each other well enough that they actually traveled to Mexico. This has nothing to do necessarily with the topic, but apparently Bonhoeffer was a terrible driver. So I'm thinking maybe Jean Lasserre did most of the driving on that trip. Lasserre really helped lead Bonhoeffer to a new appreciation of the Sermon on the Mount and the need to take seriously Jesus' command to be a peacemaker. And Eberhard Bethge was Bonhoeffer's student, became a confessing partner, dear friend. Bethge wrote the 1,000-page biography of Bonhoeffer. Bethge credits Lasserre with providing the initial impulse for Bonhoeffer to write Discipleship, which the first English translation was called The Cost of Discipleship, which I think is a great title. When we did this new edition, it was supposed to be a scholarly edition, and the German word is Nachfolge, so discipleship or following after Jesus could have been the title of that. I tried. One of the battles I lost is I said, we got to keep Cost of Discipleship. That's just such a good title. That was the preacher in me thinking we got to keep that title. I did not win the day on that. And so but discipleship, I'm talking about, some of you may have, many people, often the first book they read from Bonhoeffer is The Cost of Discipleship, or now it's Discipleship in this new edition. Bonhoeffer strongly encouraged the reluctant Lasserre to attend ecumenical conferences. Bonhoeffer got involved with the ecumenical movement fairly early on, and he thought, Lasserre, you can share your insights into Jesus's peace commandment. Lasserre will end up coming to a key conference that I'll be talking about in a little bit. So first, I want to take a look at Bonhoeffer's what we might call peaceful resistance to the Nazi regime. So just a little background, the shadow of the rising threat of Nazism, especially like 1932, it was clear the Nazis were on the rise. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, that's the long name for the Nazis, were gaining public support. By 1932, unemployment had reached 30%. Just think of that. I mean, we do not have 30% unemployment. In fact, right now, during this election, the employment was one of the lowest in my memory. Was unemployment was quite low. Hitler was a rising star, and in May of 1932, so again, before Hitler comes to power, and he'll come to power in January of 1933, but the German Christian movement was founded, which was a form of Christian nationalism. So think in Germany, you have basically the Catholic Church and what we would call the Protestant Church. It was called the Evangelische Kirche there, but evangelical, we have a certain image of evangelicals. So we ended up translating, when we were talking about evangelicals in Germany, we talked about the Protestant Church, unless we were using the actual title of a church. So you've got those two groups. Within the Protestant churches, then, there was this German Christian movement, which was a form of what we would call Christian nationalism. And it was instrumental. This group was instrumental in the attempted Nazification of the German evangelical church. And one of Hitler's goals was to try to unify all these regional Protestant churches in Germany into one unified church, presumably so he could control it more readily. With the Catholics, he needed to reach an agreement, a different agreement. Obviously, he wasn't going to have necessarily the same influence there with the Catholic Church, but he was able to come up with an agreement where basically we'll do our thing and the church can do its thing. But this German Christian movement then was growing even before Hitler was officially in power. In a May 8th, 1932 sermon that Bonhoeffer gave at Trinity Church in Berlin, and in fact, he was doing pulpit supply there, he said, he used 2 Chronicles 20:12. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. And he talks about King Jehoshaphat, who's not sure how to respond to a threat to the people of Israel. And Bonhoeffer himself was struggling. How am I, and how are we going to respond to the Nazi threat? And there's a quotation in there where it talks about the ground on which we stand has become unstable. And he will talk 10 years later in an essay called After 10 Years, he will talk about we have so little ground under our feet. And he's talking to some fellow conspirators. And so this image of the ground being unstable, where I live here in Oregon, our biggest worry, not tornadoes or hurricanes or things like that. Our biggest worry is an earthquake. I've been in an earthquake, fortunately not the big one as it's called, but the ground, when it's moving under your feet, it gets your attention. And so that's an interesting image that he used. That's how he was really wrestling with this and really trying to figure out where do we go from here. In a June 19th, then 1932 sermon at the Kaiser Wilhelm Church in Berlin, one of the classic characteristics of a prophet is the ability to see things before the rest of us. And I think Bonhoeffer had that ability. I mean, he's a young guy here, and it's amazing some of the things that he perceived. I want to read for you just a quotation. I've got portions of it there. But this is a passage, so he's writing this again before Hitler's actually in power. And he writes, if that is really the way it must be, we should not be surprised if for our church too, times will come again when the blood of martyrs will be required. But this blood, if we really still have the courage and honor and faithfulness to shed it, will not be as innocent and untarnished as that of the first witnesses. On our blood would lie great guilt of our own, the guilt of the worthless slave who is thrown into the outer darkness. One issue that people have written quite a bit on over the years is whether Bonhoeffer was a true martyr, or was he a political martyr, or was he truly a faith martyr? And I think here he's recognizing that the whole issue, even of his martyrdom, may be something that's not clear when the time comes, and also true then for others who may end up resisting this movement that he sees emerging. In an August 1st, 1932 letter to an American friend, Paul Lehman's somebody, again, he met while he was at Union Seminary in 31, and Paul Lehman and his wife really took him in. They even helped him celebrate his 25th birthday. So, they became pretty good friends. Uh, but he mentions in this letter he's not so worried about Hitler initiating violence, but wondered if Hitler could keep his followers quiet. When I came across that, that was not necessarily what I expected to find, but actually is more worried about Hitler's followers at that point than Hitler himself. In terms of Bonhoeffer's early criticism then of the Nazi regime, in February 1st, 1933, so this is 2 days after Hitler came to power, Bonhoeffer did a radio broadcast critiquing the so-called leadership principle. And he warned in there of the danger of making an idol of the leader, In April 1933, he wrote an essay called The Church and the Jewish Question and shared it with a gathering of clergy. But he was particularly critical of the Aryan clause, which you had to be Aryan in order to be employed by the state. It's tricky in Germany because the church basically was able to function and run itself, but your paycheck came from the state. The state would collect the so-called church tax, and that's where your paycheck came from. So technically, then you could argue that you had to be Aryan in order to be in the church and get your paycheck. And so this became an issue in that way. But the key thing I want to lift up here is that in this essay, he identifies three possible actions toward an unjust state. And this could be a state that's committed something in injustice or is not doing something they needed to do. And so the injustice could also be because of them omitting something or not doing what they needed to do. First thing he said is to question whether the state is fulfilling its responsibilities. Elsewhere, he talked about calling sin by its rightful name. He does that in an essay in volume 16. The second thing is to aid the victims of state action. And then the third is to seize the wheel itself and engage in direct political action. That meant the image there is where the state's out of control. And so you have to do something to try to bring things under control again. So those were the three possible actions he identified in 33. In May of 29th through the 31st of 1934, the Barmen Declaration was issued. There's a gathering at Barmen, and this declaration was issued. Bonhoeffer was part of some of the preparation for that. But Karl Barth was considered the principal author of that Barmen Declaration, and basically it was resisting the inroads of the Nazis into the church. Term status confessionis is articles of faith in which the church stands or fall. They identified 6 articles. I'm not going to go through them all, but for example, Article 2 makes clear that Jesus Christ, not Adolf Hitler, is the Lord of all areas of life. Now, they didn't say Adolf Hitler in the declaration, but they said very clearly that Jesus Christ is the Lord of all areas of life. Eventually, 7,000 pastors will sign it. That's one estimate that I've come across. That was maybe a third, maybe a little more than a third of Protestant pastors ended up signing this, and this was the basis for the formation of what became known as the Confessing Church within the Protestant Church. Bonhoeffer during this, he's not there at Barmen. He's in England serving a German church, or 2 German churches, and a letter he wrote to Karl Barth, you get the sense he doesn't say it explicitly, but he's wondering if he's running away from his responsibility there in Germany. And he finally, in fact, he takes the call and goes there before he tells Karl Barth what he's doing, because I think he admits he was worried about what Barth might say to him. And Barth basically wrote back, yeah, what are you doing there? You should be here in Germany helping us, do what we're doing right now. I bring this up because I think this is part of Bonhoeffer. We have this image of a guy who's part of a conspiracy, but he's struggling at times to find his way in terms of how to resist and how the church needs to resist. Bonhoeffer's critique, he supported the Barmen Declaration, but he critiqued, there was not one word about the treatment of the Jews in that Barmen Declaration. Bonhoeffer is often associated with a group called the Young Radicals in the Confessing Church, and he's and he wanted something to be said about the treatment of the Jews. In his mind, if you think of Matthew 25, as much he's done, it's one of the least of these. In his view, the way the Jews are being treated, we are treating Christ. That tells something about our relationship to who Jesus is. So that was his critique. The reason that wasn't included is because they wanted to get as many people to approve this Barmen Declaration as possible. And the thought was, if we include that, we're just not going to get enough people to sign it. I think it was, you can call that practical or just not stepping up and doing what needed to be done. But that was the dynamic that was going on there. Then, in terms of the peace sermon that he delivered, so he's in still serving these German congregations, but he attends this ecumenical conference in Fanø, Denmark, in August of 1934. Jean Lasserre attended this ecumenical conference, and Bonhoeffer delivers a sermon speech there on peace. It's well-known sermon, and I just want to quote a couple of things from there, and I've got some of the points here, but let me just read for you. For example, this is a radical call to peace that he issues there. And peace on earth, he says, is not a problem, but a command of Jesus. And then here, he says, they cannot take up arms against Christ himself. Yet this is what they do. This is Christians do if they take up arms against one another. So he's talking about you've got Christian groups within Europe taking up arms against one another. That's what he's critiquing there. And then there's the kind of maybe the most famous lines from this sermon. There is no way to peace along the way of safety, for peace must be dared. It is the great venture. It can never be made safe. Peace is the opposite of security. To demand guarantees is to mistrust, and this mistrust is in turn brings forth war. I think that's the one essay or speech we shared with you so that you would have a copy of that. Obviously, you've got Bonhoeffer here with strong leanings toward pacifism. In an effort to put these nonviolent teachings in the Sermon on the Mount into action. At this time, Bonhoeffer was seriously considering going to India to study nonviolent resistance under Gandhi. And he really wanted to go. He actually had an invitation from Gandhi that Bishop Bell in England had secured for him, but he never ended up making it to India to study under Gandhi. But he was obviously familiar with some of the nonviolent techniques. Presumably, that's what he wanted to go to study under Gandhi. In doing some further research, his grandmother actually suggested to him going to India even before Hitler came to power. And his 91-year-old grandmother, I'll say something toward the end about her, because she's become, for me, a real model of resistance that I think we need to pay attention to, in addition to paying attention to Bonhoeffer. So what he decides to do then, rather than go to India, rather than stay in those churches in England, he ends up directing a illegal confessing church seminary. The state church, the Protestant church, they were making it difficult for these confessing churches, congregations, and pastors just to do what they needed to do, even when it comes to educating young pastors to serve in the church. And so they formed 5 of these illegal seminaries, and Bonhoeffer was invited to be one of the directors of the one at Finkenwalde. There was really a daily liturgy, I put that in quotation, but balancing communal worship, study, personal meditation, meals together, service to others, confession, and recreation and leisure. And Bonhoeffer, Betke once said to me, I got a chance to meet Betke back in '89, and my wife and I met Betke and his wife. They would come every so often to the International Bonhoeffer Society board meetings and annual meetings. And I asked Betke, what stood out for you about Bonhoeffer? And I was expecting some profound answer from him that I could share with a group like this. And he said, that guy could do in 2 hours what took the rest of us 10 hours to do. And obviously, I think most of us can relate far more to the 10-hour types. But the thing is here Bonhoeffer, in the midst of what's going on, and in a sense, that seminary was a community was resisting what was going on in Germany at the time. But in the midst of that, Bonhoeffer, after dinner, would want to do something enjoyable, sports or sing music or just go for a hike along the beach and so on. And so that was part of the rhythm of life there. As hard as they worked there, recreation and leisure was part of the rhythm of life. In terms of life together as resistance, the Bonhoeffer lifts up a notion of a community based on love, and he can't come right out and say it in Life Together, but this is over against the Nazi concept of community based on biology and race. And so this Life Together is a wonderful book, and we can learn a lot from it, but it is a critique of that form of community. The Nazis, by the way, talked about Gemeinschaft, community, all the time. That was a big theme for the Nazis. So it became tricky how you talk about community in that context. And so Bonhoeffer, this is one way that Bonhoeffer is doing it and also living it out then in that seminary community. There was a strong emphasis at Finkenwalde on the Sermon on the Mount, and the Gestapo closes down Finkenwalde in 1937. In terms of discipleship as resistance, again, mentioned the cost of discipleship, which was the first English title. Nachfolge actually means discipleship or following after. There's a distinction Bonhoeffer draws that's quite well known between cheap grace and costly grace, and the tendency is for cheap grace to be the norm in faith communities. And I've been a part of this. I've been a leader of faith communities where I think we've specialized in cheap grace much of the time. A line from that here in the new edition is, "Whenever Christ calls us, his call leads us to death." A very striking statement in that book. There's a lengthy chapter on the Sermon on the Mount and discipleship. Jesus's followers are called to peace, he writes, and not merely have peace, but they make peace. And he stresses that in this lengthy chapter. He emphasizes renouncing violence and strife in discipleship. Discipleship ends up getting published in 37. Disciples choose to suffer rather than inflict suffering on others. So this is where he's at that point as he's teaching their life together. The majority of churches in Nazi Germany were not well prepared to practice loyalty to Jesus in the face of competing loyalties, let alone suffer persecution for following Jesus. In terms of Bonhoeffer, there comes a time where he, I think, becomes especially disillusioned with the confessing church, and I'm simplifying the narrative here, but let me just give a couple of ideas of what I think's going on. He reached a point where he believed that the church was failing to live up to the confession at Barmen, and he's critiquing not the German Christians per se, they're the ones that are committing idolatry in that, but confessing churches. By 1938, 85% of confessing church pastors, the ones that exercised some resistance against Hitler and the Nazis, had taken an oath of loyalty to Hitler. And we have to be careful here because it would be easy to throw stones at them, but these guys, they're in a situation where if they don't do this, they could be thrown in prison. Their lives might be at issue. Their well-being of their families at stake. So that you can understand the kind of pressure they were up against. By the way, Bonhoeffer, during the 30s there, he did have somebody who I think he at least thought of getting married to, and he was very concerned. He had some sense that he would not be an easy guy to be married to, given what was going on in Germany at the time. Although a month before he gets arrested in 43, he will finally get engaged to Maria von Wedemeyer, but because of his arrest, they never actually got married, even though she did keep visiting him occasionally in prison. He critiqued the confessing church for failing to confess Christ concretely against the persecution of the Jews. So this comes up again. So he said they caved in on the oath of allegiance to Hitler, and then what really really disillusioned him, I think, was there was no official statement against Kristallnacht. In Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, this is where the Nazi henchmen went crazy throughout Germany, vandalizing synagogues and Jewish businesses. And Bonhoeffer, we tend to think of him, as being a leader of the confessing church. Well, yes, he was a leader in some sense, but he wasn't one of the bishop types, and he wanted an official statement from the church. That's what he was looking for, and there was no official statement that came out against Kristallnacht and critiquing it. He actually in his personal Bible, he writes a little note where it says all the meeting places. It's in Psalm 73, 74, I think it is, where it talks all the meeting places burned in the land. And he writes a note by that, connects it with Kristallnacht. But he's purported to have said, when today the synagogues are set afire, tomorrow the churches will burn. And so he had some sense that eventually the churches might suffer the same fate. Now then, in terms of Bonhoeffer's extraordinary engagement in a violent conspiracy, he made a decision to return to Germany. And by the way, that number one there looks like 2 points somehow got mixed up. Sorry, I didn't catch that. But number one should be, there was a concern for Bonhoeffer's well-being and safety by Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Lehmann, and some of these people that he had known at Union. And so they wanted to bring him over to the United States for his own protection. Maybe get him a teaching position. If he'd have stayed in the United States, he might have had a long career. Some of us are old enough to have maybe had a class from him when he was a retired professor or something like that. But he decides to go back very quickly. Decides to go back to Germany, and so that was June 20th, 1939. And let me grab that for you. Let me just read what he writes to Reinhold Niebuhr, because he felt he owed Reinhold Niebuhr an explanation. And this is what he wrote. I've made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period of our national history with the Christian people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make this choice in security. So a year later, then, after he returned to Germany, a year later, France surrendered, June 17th, 1940. There was utter jubilation in Germany at that time over the surrender of France. Hitler didn't miss it. Any symbolism he was very good at symbolism. So he made France sign their surrender in that same railroad car that the Treaty of Versailles had been signed in when Germany had to surrender after World War I. By the way, the Versailles Treaty, even the Bonhoeffer family, nobody liked that Versailles Treaty. I'm not going to focus on that, but that was a common thing that people did not like. And so there was utter jubilation. There was a parade through Germany, or through Berlin after that surrender of France, and estimated 2 million people, largest parade in Berlin history. Hitler comes through in the cars, the whole parade cars through there, and people are ecstatic about that. Bonhoeffer and Bethge were at a cafe in Memel in Eastern Germany, and people were even up on the tables when this announcement came over a loudspeaker there at the cafe. Bonhoeffer put up his arm in the Nazi salute, and Bethge goes, "What is he doing?" And Bonhoeffer just whispered to him, "This is not the time to basically take on that salute, because we do not want to draw our attention to ourselves." And so Bethge's assessment is that this is where Bonhoeffer's double life truly began. Now, he was getting involved in conspiracy, but he really began to get more seriously involved and active in it following that. Um, the surrender meant there was the hope for a quick military defeat of Hitler and the Nazis, that the Allies were just going to make this happen. That hope kind of faded at that point, and I think the conspirators had to intensify their efforts. His role in the conspiracy, he was a courier for the resistance group operating out of the Office of Military Intelligence, the Abwehr. So he was assigned to engage in secret talks with foreign church leaders who would communicate with Allied leaders concerning plans and aims of the resistance movement. His role as a courier qualified him for what's called a UK classification, declaring him unabkömmlich, or indispensable. That is, he was engaged in a civilian occupation essential to the war effort. Kind of amazed that as much as they shut him down, but he couldn't publish, he couldn't do all this stuff, and yet he still was able to travel at that time. I'm kind of amazed by that. By the way, his efforts, he was communicating through Bishop Bell, for example, and Bishop Bell would talk to Anthony Eden, the Secretary of State for Great Britain, for the British, and finally the answer was no answer, because the British were not going to trust any Germans, not even these conspirators. Bishop Bell trusted Bonhoeffer and was hoping for more response from the Allied side, but there was basically silence. And given his involvement in conspiracy, then it can say that ultimately led to his execution by the Nazis. So let me just say, Bonhoeffer draws a distinction between what we might call ordinary situations, more ordinary life, and what he calls an extraordinary venture of responsibility, or a free venture of responsibility. I think it's important to see his involvement in the conspiracy is in his mind is an extraordinary situation, and I'll say this more than once. Yes, he did it. He can give an account of why he did it, but he doesn't want it to be a model for other people to copy. This is not a justification for Christian nationalists to engage in violence against evil, for example. That's a misuse of Bonhoeffer. Let me go through some extraordinary aspects of this. So, contemporary assessment of Bonhoeffer's role, he's often celebrated as a modern Christian martyr, but it's striking, and Bethke writes about this in the biography, striking that he sought to avoid justifying his actions. In fact, Bethke says he would have admitted that their response may have even been tardy. They waited too long. So, for example, presumably he thought the time for nonviolent resistance had passed. He draws a distinction between giving an account of one's actions. So, yes, we can give an account of our actions, even in this situation, versus justifying one's actions. His ethics is a strong critique of any effort to justify ourselves before and after the fact. That's just not the point. We seek to discern what God's calling us to do, discern the will of God best we can, but you do not engage in justification. Hard to avoid that, but that's what he's aiming at here. Responsible action is action on behalf of or in the place of others without expectation of return. Real innocence, he said, is not keeping oneself free of sin and guilt, but willingly entering into the community of guilt for the sake of others. So he doesn't view his involvement in conspiracy as guilt-free. You're still trying to murder somebody. So to argue that somehow you're guilt-free was just not the point. There was no theological, biblical, or ecclesial precedent for a Lutheran pastor in Germany to be engaged in a conspiracy. And I think, obviously, that's just not something. None of my congregations would have said, "Oh yeah, we expect you to get involved in something like that." That's just not what pastors are supposed to do, and it certainly was that way for him in Germany. He was breaking the law. He committed treason, and the charge was removed in 1996. In some ways, I think maybe the charge should have stood. I think it almost makes his witness stronger because he was willing to even go to the length of committing treason because of the extreme situation he found himself in. He also argues we cannot in principle refuse to lie or deceive. It's a wonderful essay in volume 16. Now it used to be part of the ethics, earlier translation of ethics, where he talks about what does it mean to tell the truth. And if he had refused to lie or deceive, as we normally maybe tend to think of lying or deceiving, he was lying through his teeth when he was being interrogated. So, and I'm going to say a little more about that in a moment. There were no other options at that point that he could see to stop Hitler, and so it was time to seize the wheel. It cost him an opportunity to fulfill more ordinary responsibilities, such as marriage, teaching, serving a parish. I mean, he had been silenced, and then, he got arrested, so his engagement, he couldn't follow through on getting married. Justification, finally, is only something God can do. He comments in this After 10 Years, written at Christmas time, 1942, that we have so little ground under our feet. The responsible attitude then is not to take justification into our own hands before, during, or after our actions. And finally, God is the ultimate judge. And just add here some wonderful things in his passages in his ethics where he talks about God's graciousness. And so the God who judges us is the God who loves us. And so even when we engage in actions that we're not absolutely certain about, those will be judged, and God will carry forward that which needs to be carried forward and leave behind that which needs to be left behind. And through that all, we can still count on God's love for us. So very, very much grounded in his understanding of God's grace. In terms of telling the truth concretely, talks about we have become cunning and learned the arts of obfuscation and equivocal speech. This is in this After 10 Years again. In terms of his indictment, he was first interrogated about his involvement in Operation 7, which was an effort to get 14 people of Jewish descent into Switzerland. Nazis thought he and others were trying to make money with this, so that didn't go anywhere. But finally, he was indicted for invasion of military service and helping others evade military service, which I think he actually was guilty of. I mean, so they finally got there. At that point, for the first year or so, they did not know of the full extent of his involvement in conspiracy. He had develops a concept of living truth under the impact of these interrogations. This is where he writes this essay on what does it mean to tell the truth. It's important to be truthful, not in principle, but concretely, taking into account the relevant relationships, intentions, and real circumstances. He even makes a comment, telling the truth must be learned. We need to grow in our capacity to perceive reality. And so saying a truthful word is based on our perception of what's real in terms of our relationship to God, other human beings. And I think today we would add our relationship to the whole of creation. We're looking for the fitting word for the occasion. What's the fitting word? What's the word, truthful word that needs to be said in the given occasion? And so the question one might ask is, to what extent is Bonhoeffer being a truth teller in the interrogations when he is lying through his teeth? Why is he doing that? Well, he wants to protect his fellow conspirators. He doesn't want to reveal what's the conspiracy. He's protecting family members. Bonhoeffer was, the Bonhoeffer name was known by many in terms of in positions of leadership. So is he being a truth teller when he's lying is the question that we're faced with there. Now, I don't want to comment briefly on in the fall of 2024, so just a few months ago, before the election, there was a petition developed against the misuse of Bonhoeffer to support political violence and Christian nationalism. It was co-sponsored by the International Bonhoeffer Society English Language Section Board. It was a critique of Eric Metaxas. Some of you may have read Eric Metaxas's biography of Bonhoeffer. Metaxas knows how to market way better than the rest of the Bonhoeffer scholars I know, because he sold so many copies of that. And he has a particular perspective, but Metaxas is what we might call, group him together with other Christian nationalists, a strong supporter of President Trump. The critique of this petition basically was that they've turned Bonhoeffer's engagement in a violent conspiracy into a principle to be followed in their fight against what they perceive as evil. So you do whatever it takes to resist evil, even if it means violence. This next sentence, I got the wrong word. It's Bonhoeffer resisted turning his engagement in the conspiracy into a principle for action. Never intended to become a principle for action from his, not, that would definitely not be consistent with the ethics that he develops, the ethical approach. He found himself in an extraordinary situation. The temptation is for us to assume we are in an extraordinary situation when more ordinary measures are needed. And so, for example, I'll just use the maybe recent thing for me that I really noticed was this election of a judge in Wisconsin. Obviously, getting people out to vote in that election was an important thing to do. And so Bonhoeffer's 91-year-old grandmother, on April 1st, 1933, there was a boycott of Jewish businesses 2 months after Hitler comes to power. His grandmother just said, I'm going to shop where I usually shop. And she walked right through a cordon of Nazi soldiers and into this big department store there in Berlin, which was owned by a Jewish family. So she just, that was her form of resistance at that point. She went shopping. She resisted by shopping. And none of those young soldiers were going to stop a 91-year-old grandmother. Nobody was foolish enough to even try to do that at that point. So again, it's really important as we learn from Bonhoeffer, again, not to take his involvement in a violent conspiracy as a principle of action. And that's what this petition really addressed. There was a movie that came out in November. Maybe some of you have seen it, called Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Spy, and Assassin. The actors in that movie actually came out with a statement in support of this petition. And we weren't sure that would happen, but that was encouraging. The Bonhoeffer family, there's approximately 100 members of the Bonhoeffer family in Germany. 86 out of 100 of those family members they got signatures and signed a statement of support for this petition. Just some conclusions then, a few conclusions. Importance of being a peacemaker concretely, not in principle. There's no formula for being a faithful peacemaker, especially in the most difficult situations. It's essential to take into account real circumstances, relevant relationships, intentions, consequences, and so on. Bonhoeffer is an exemplar to learn from, not a model to be copied. And Bonhoeffer's unwavering commitment was to following Jesus, and this comes from an August 1944 letter to Eberhard Bethge, and that means it's after July 20th. That was the failure of what they were almost sure would be a successful attempt to assassinate Hitler. So it's written after that. And he says, we must immerse ourselves again and again for a long time and quite calmly in Jesus's life, his sayings, actions, suffering, and dying in order to recognize what God promises it fulfills. And then a final point, only God can make the final judgment on whether we have been faithful making peace. All right. Well, thank you for your attention. And I think Ellen's going to field and alert us to questions that need to be asked.
The first question is from Beth, and she just wants to know whether Bonhoeffer, I think it's in connection to you mentioning foreign clergy, whether he had any connection to Michael Faulhaber.
Boy, I don't know. I'd have to research that. That name, is it Faulhaber?
Faulhaber. Faulhaber.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that name I've come across it, but I can't give you a good solid answer to that. So I'd have to do a little more research on that. But I have seen that name in the course of reading and researching that.
My personal interest in it is that he was my sister-in-law's great uncle, Michael Faulhaber.
Oh, is that right? Huh.
And we've spent a lot of time trying to find out just where he was. He was the Cardinal Archbishop of Cologne. And
okay.
There's information on both sides. It's really difficult to say where he really was and what he really did. So I know that in some way is beside the conversation we're having tonight, but I'm always curious. So I was just wondering if you knew.
I suspect if you email me, one of the things that's volume 17 of the edition, we have literally virtually every name in the whole 16-volume set is somehow identified with at least some basic information about each person. And So my guess is his name is in there somewhere.
What I understand is that not too long ago, a large volume of his diary was discovered, and it's in the process of being translated from, I guess, a rather archaic shorthand that he used into German. Well, I don't read a word of German, but it's supposed to be available online.
Oh,
And
that
I'm,
sounds interesting.
yeah, but anyway, I don't want to distract, so maybe we can
Sure.
talk about it later. But
I think what's important there is, a church leader like he was, and how he was finding his way through all this. That would be
Mhm.
very interesting to see how he was finding his way through it all.
Yep.
Mm.
Okay, so Wes asked, how does Bonhoeffer's understanding of truth impact or influence our cultural notion of the big lie, or he calls it truthiness and historical erasure?
Oh,
That's a lot of questions.
yeah. Well, I've got a response to this one. I think
Good.
that maybe I get asked quite often for people that they're paying attention. They say, "Well, what are the parallels between Nazi Germany and what we're going through in our time?" Uh, and one thing I can say for sure is the big lie about January 6th in particular. And I know there's so many things that have been where the truth has been so fuzzy, at least, or just outright compromised. But that kind of telling a big lie about January 6th is right out of the Nazi playbook. They were masters of the big lie. And so that parallel is there, where and I try to imagine what the Nazis were pretty good at using the communication and media tools available to them at the time. If you can imagine what they would do today, my sense is they would have been maybe even more destructive. If that's hard to imagine them being more destructive, but the big lie is right out of the Nazi playbook, and it just needs to be called what it is, and that's what January 6th needs to be called. But it's tricky because a lot of people, big lies, the strategy was if you just tell a big lie and do it with enough passion and energy, people will believe it. And we've seen that in our own context.
Now we have another one from George Dunn, and he says, if in an extraordinary situation, Christians decide, and there's a couple questions embedded here, but I think maybe before it assumes we all understand what an extraordinary situation is. And you mentioned it, and you said that's one of the distinctions that Bonhoeffer's making in terms of why he takes certain steps, and how would you understand it? And then I think the rest of his questions then will make sense. Because he says,
Okay.
if an extraordinary situation, well, I don't know what the criteria are for that. Christians decide they must take up arms. Is there a way to do so that's consistent with loving one's enemy?
Yeah, so I have done, and I gave you a bit of an idea of this, but in the interest of time, when I talked about the extraordinary venture responsibility, think of the ordinary. Bonhoeffer when he's writing his ethics, he's trying to understand, his own involvement in this conspiracy, but he's also thinking ahead to Germany after the war and what it's going to be when you try to return to more ordinary times where basic things like can be work responsibilities and family responsibilities and church responsibilities will be a little more ordinary again. So if that's part of what he's doing and is thinking ahead to the reconstruction of Germany after the war. But when you're in a situation where, so for example, his ability to preach has been taken away. He was silenced. He wasn't supposed to preach or teach in those early, when he's part of this conspiracy. He's been forbidden to do that. He has to, each week he has to report. It's called a residency restriction. He's banned from publishing. So it's when you take away all these things that we tend to take for granted, being able to fulfill the kind of basic responsibilities we have, which also includes our abilities to respond, culture, art, when those things are being compromised and we can't do those basic things that are part of life, that's ordinary situation. Extraordinary means we're up against it. And imagine now if we literally lose the right to vote in this country. Right now we can still vote, and there's a Supreme Court judge in Wisconsin that's going to be the Supreme Court judge there. You can still vote. And so we have to be careful, I think, to be aware of the ordinary kinds of things we can do, or go shopping like Julie Toffel did. My wife, during Black History Month, we have these 3 kids from Liberia, or 2 from Liberia, 1 from Sierra Leone. For years, she's gotten them cards for Black History Month, just a card to tell them, remembering them and so on. And during Black History Month, she went to Macy's, J.C. Penney's, and one other one, just basic department stores. None of them this year had anything connected with Black History Month. So my wife, if you know her, she talked to the manager at all 3 of those places, but the managers were undoubtedly getting it from on high. And the managers also said, we're not going to do Pride Month either in June. Just told her outright. Well, there again, so one form of resistance, Donna talked to my wife talked to these managers. Did it change everything? No, but they're still they're part of the flow of life. Even though life may be a little trickier and harder, there's things you can do that are more ordinary. But when you just there's literally every avenue for resisting. Another way to put this might be where every avenue for resisting that you maybe that you thought would be available is gone. That's when you're in an extraordinary situation, and it's one where then nobody's in a position to throw stones at people when they're in that, the image of throwing a stone. It's just there's something about that situation that just doesn't fit.
So thank you.
So I have. Go ahead.
I was going to say thank you for doing that, because then I think this helps with George's question, because he says, if in an extraordinary situation, Christians decide they must take up arms, can one do that consistent with loving one's enemy? And his corresponding question is, what would Bonhoeffer say is the proper attitude to take towards the, let's say, enemy soldier, rival partisan, whom one is actively seeking to harm? Can we seek their destruction without sinning?
Yeah, he says a couple of things there, but Bonhoeffer says in that peace sermon in 34, he really critiques the fact that Christians are killing Christians. But also, if you push that, it doesn't have to be just Christians killing Christians. Human beings killing human beings. If each human being is created in the image of God, at the very least, if you're engaged in war, there's nothing pure about that. I'm speaking from Bonhoeffer's perspective here. There would be nothing pure about that. And on the other hand, Bonhoeffer, he had these seminarians at Finkenwalde, and over half of them ended up, or back the majority ended up fighting on the front lines for Germany. They didn't have any choice. They were conscripted into the German army. Bonhoeffer writes in volume 16 that I was the editor for, there's 7 of these circular letters or newsletter type thing that they managed to send out to these seminarians wherever they may be. Some were also in kind of small congregations in rural Germany and places like that. And but you see Bonhoeffer, the pastor work, it's amazing how he's not critical of them. He's not judgmental in those letters of these soldiers that are fighting. Even though he himself had these pacifist leaning and did not want to fight, he did not want to fight in the war. So how do we? And then you'd say, what compels? It was tricky. I think tricky one was when Ukraine was attacked. I remember in tech study even we were struggling with that one. Like when you're attacked in that way, can you defend yourself? And at a certain point, I don't think there's just a nice, clean answer to that. But Bonhoeffer would say as much if you do your ethical homework, so to speak, you're struggling with it. But finally, again, the ultimate judgment of that is not for us to make. That's the ultimate judgment, is God's judgment to make. And we're being judged, given his faith convictions, we're being judged by a God who loves us. And I think he's clinging to that even as he's going through this incredibly tough time where he gets involved in a conspiracy. By the way, Betke once said of Bonhoeffer, he says he had no clue how to shoot a gun, use explosives or whatever. So yes, he was involved in a violent conspiracy, but he was not going to be the guy to pull the trigger. He just didn't know how to even do it, basically.
Mhm, mhm. So we have a slightly different approach here, but it's asking for what would you say would be the key aspect we can do within our congregations, both local and live stream, where we can address these truths re regarding Christian nationalism?
Well, I think Christian nationalism, I don't want to say that's an easy one, but that's just sheer idolatry. And I think in one way or another, it needs to be named in our congregations. And I'm not surprised there's Christian congregations that see a happy marriage between the nation and the Christian faith. And they've been a strong force and in many ways were key to President Trump getting elected. But that's one, and the pastors where I'm at now, where the two pastors, they I think they're handling that quite well. They don't shy away from it, but they're aware that not everybody is on the. I'd say the congregation now leans more towards the progressive side, so to speak, but it's not all the way there, and so they're trying to be, they're respectful, but you got to name idolatry. I mean, Christian nationalism is idolatry, and we need to say so. I did see one of these popped up to me. I just want to, because it's a follow up on what I was
Yes,
talking
I was
about.
about to get to that. I just doing them in order.
Yeah, in terms of basically we're called to love every person, and so I don't know if killing somebody and telling them you love them may not really come across well, but I think outright hate of somebody would definitely be something that's just not part of who we are as followers of Jesus. You love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And that's where it gets tricky when you go to war. This is what Bonhoeffer was struggling with in that peace sermon, even in 34. How can you kill somebody and profess to follow Christ? That just made no sense to him. But even killing, and I think that's why he was guilty of committing treason, and still, yes, we're compelled to do what we can do to stop Hitler because of the damage he's causing, but we're still committing murder against somebody. So again, that whole effort to try to justify ourselves after the fact, he's really comes on strong against that in ethics.
So then we have from Tom, again, trying to pull the thoughts together. What do you see as the primary lessons from Bonhoeffer for us in our current situation? If you were to boil one or two thoughts down, or maybe what we can take from.
Yeah, no, I do think just being aware of Christian nationalism is important. I do think there's a tendency to be just write off people, and I think we need to somehow figure out how to at least talk with people, try to understand where they're coming from, but not be naive about the fact that they're just going to adopt a certain way of thinking. But I have a brother-in-law who's voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and I remember being there at New Year's. He wasn't in office yet, but at New Year's Eve, and we talked. I asked him why he voted for Donald Trump, and he said, this is back in 2016. He says, well, he's a businessman, and business was important to him. And then when I pressed him a little more, he just could not bring himself to vote for Hillary Clinton. I said, well, why not? What is it about her that stands out? And he said, it feels like she's looking down her nose at me. Now, whether that's accurate or not, that was his perception, and it was that he was being looked down upon. And so how do we stand up for, stand against idolatry of Christian nationalism? How do we stand against these destructive things we've seen, and still do it in a way which communicates some respect for that person? I thought I don't know what others thought, but the bishop, Marianne Buddy, when she spoke on the day after the inauguration, what I appreciate about that was in the flow of her duties. That's something she would have done, and she was there. And then she issues this plea for to the president for mercy. She had to seize the day there because that was her opportunity to have a kind of hearing she wasn't going to have any other time. And so I commend her for seizing this, speaking up. It's an official, a leader speaking up in that circumstance, but pleading for mercy. I thought she was about as respectful as she possibly could be to the president and still challenge him on where he stood in relationship to these people that were just literally scared of what's going on in the country.
Yeah, it's complicated. I think Steve Biegler asked about a curriculum to Lori Brandt Hale's new Bonhoeffer curriculum for congregations, and then Andrew, our tech guy, and keeps us going, put the link in the chat if you are interested in that. Tom follows up with what kind of collective action or advocacy do you believe Lutheran Christians, all our faith communities, can do to make a difference in our current situation? You're being asked all the tough questions, for which there may not be any answers, but you know.
I'll do easier ones first, because when you're talking about Lori Brandt Hale, so she's the president of the International Bonhoeffer Society English Language Section, which includes people from Great Britain, South Africa, Australia. So all those places are part of that organization. But I would just encourage you to go on the bonhoeffersociety.org, to go on there and at the very least just register. You will get invited to make a donation, but even if you don't make a donation, just register and get there. And that's where you can get information about the class, this curriculum, and some other things that are being offered. And so that if you're interested in more in Bonhoeffer, I just encourage you to connect with that. With that, in terms of collective action, part of that depends, the kind of the congregation you're in and where people are at in that congregation. The congregation I'm in, both pastors I know will be in an advocacy day in Salem, Oregon, our state capital, on Monday. Actually, they'll be there. And so they're involved. There's a number of lay people from the congregation. It's not like the whole congregation is involved necessarily in all these things, but it's not like there's people in the congregation trying to sabotage those efforts either. So I do think one thing that, again, Bonhoeffer was so big on paying attention to the concrete situation in which you find yourself. When we're not able to do certain things on the federal level, then maybe we need to look for state action or even local community action. Again, not to ignore what's going on at the federal level, but what can we act? So I'll give you one example. Here in Oregon, we're considering an environmental rights amendment that would be put into the Oregon State Constitution. 3 states, Montana, Hawaii, and Pennsylvania, have already done something like this. Oregon has when I was in high school, Tom McCall was our governor, Republican governor in the early 70s with a Republican president. There was a lot of environmental measures adopted at that time, both in our state and across the nation. And so now there's an organization, a coalition of groups here in Oregon. And so this is something, if the state legislature approves this, it will go to the voters and we'll vote on it as a state, whether to make that a part of our Constitution. You'd say, well, no matter what's going on politically in terms of this, the environmental issues are going to need to be dealt with. That issue is there. It's not one that Bonhoeffer was up against in particular. He's worried about Hitler and the Nazis and the Holocaust and that. We've got political issues like that, but these environmental issues are there. And so I just encourage people to look for things you can actually act on. And then we'll and hopefully again we'll have elections, and as long as we have elections going on, there's potential then to win votes and get people in office. And again, they may not be perfect, but we actually still have reasonably free and fair elections. It's really, we can fight against efforts to reduce who can vote. These are all, and so it's really important, I think, for individuals and then congregations to really look at their situation and look what can we actually do in our context. But in terms of Christian nationalism stuff, it needs to be named. I mean, just there should be, we do something, organization I'm in as theologian residence, one of my main responsibilities is to lead a monthly table talk. And we tackle a variety of issues. Many of them are ethical issues, but also some other theological issues or things that come up, and we'll tackle those. So it's not a huge group, but we get people talking about these things and not being afraid to talk about them. So again, all that has to be discerned in the context in which you're in. We have our senators and representatives in Oregon, most of them in Oregon tend to be fighting against authoritarian measures and things like that. And so we sometimes don't, it's good sometimes to write letters even to the people that agree with you, just so they know they have support for what they're trying to do when they are in positions where they might be able to do things that maybe as individuals we're not able to do by ourselves.
I would also remind folks there are plenty of sort of national organizations that are church or faith-led that you can be part of. William Barber, Repairs the Breach, Poor People's Campaign. I know Tim is part of that. And, there are a variety of things that are starting to become more vocal. I think they've had some time to think about what they want to do and how they would do it. So are there any other people who want to put some questions in the chat?
Something just came to mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to sound flippant here, but when people have asked me again to compare the situations, and since I've studied Nazi Germany and Bonhoeffer so much, and I'll say, here's one sign. You look for what things are signs that we need to be even more worried than we are now. And I say the minute all the late night TV hosts are shut down, that would be really scary to me. As long as they're able to speak, and and there have been some moves now against the press so those are of concern when we see that. So being able to where we can voice disagreement and dissent is so critical in a situation where you're struggling to find your way through.
I think Tim has his hand up. So Andrew, if you can unmute him, perhaps.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Tim.
Okay.
Hey, Tim. Hello.
Sorry, I have to be off camera. I'm a little under the weather. As part of the Poor People campaign, the night after the election, we held a vigil, and some of my marginalized friends, with the Poor People's campaign said, to them, there wasn't a whole lot of difference. And so I was going to give you the example of 25 million people lost their Medicaid coverage from April 2023 to the end of the Biden term. And then now there's, the further threat, more, defunding of that program. And so what I was thinking about, it seems like it's not just one particular figure that we are dealing with empire at all times. That's one thought that I have. And then, I did have an opportunity to take to my representative a couple people that were on Medicaid that they could tell the story face to face, to get them to, really see the reality of the situation. So I'm just wondering, if Hillary Clinton would have won, and I'm, that's who I voted for, and I voted for Harris this time. But, I'm not under the illusion that like any candidate is like really ideal. So I don't think that we have sinless options really. So I don't know if you can comment or reflect upon that, or if I made any sense at all in my stomach.
No, that's very, No, I find that very helpful, Tim, and it fits with. We need to be able to engage in, again, not just identifying, we've got to take the log out of our own eye too, to a certain extent. I this isn't Bonhoeffer, but I have a quotation that I have right next to me here on my filing cabinet here, and it's comes from David James Duncan. And he's a Northwest author. He's written The River Why and The Brothers K, which is about baseball. River Why is about fishing and so on. Funny books in some ways. But he's written a series of essays called My Story is Told by Water. And then he has one essay called A Prayer for the Second Coming of the Salmon. And salmon is so critical out here. It's like iconic creature in the Pacific Northwest. But in this essay, there's a sentence where he writes, no person, no family, no country, no civilization in history has remained viable for long without engaging in corrective acts of self-criticism, self-sacrifice, and restoration. And that's, Tim, what you were sharing. That's, we need to, at the same time, we need to be truthful about what we see. It's also, we got to be truthful in reflecting on our own, where we stand. And so it's not surprising that repentance was a key concept for Bonhoeffer in terms of the faith, which is part of our Christian faith, repentance, looking at ourselves honestly. The other thing I've said to people, I don't think it's a strategy simply to be angry at President Trump and the administration. We need protests. I'm glad we've got people protest authoritarian measures and things like that. But we really need to also look on what we're professing our core values. And again, not to excuse us from doing things that maybe are a little more dangerous or take more courage, but just being, practicing life together can be a form of resistance. If we're clear on our values and lifting those up and doing things, again, that's why Bonhoeffer's grandmother is an inspiration to me, finding ways in our flow of our daily lives to articulate who we are and what we stand for. And then as we become aware of things we can do that are maybe have even greater impact, we engage in those. But it's important. It's not enough just to be angry. We've got to look at what we can do and then be self-critical. And that applies also, then I would have added, if I was writing this with David, I would have added congregations and so on in churches, that we also need to be self-critical in what we do.
Tim does raise a good point, which is some of these systems that they are they're just quickly taking some of these systems to the conclusion of where they were maybe heading anyway, or they were already being harmful. I mean, it's just, I worked in a hospital as a chaplain, and you could already see the difficulties of people who were poor and without income. We could take care of them in the hospital based on some variation of Medicaid, but often they stayed in the hospital because, and this was during Biden as well as whatever, they stayed in the hospital because nobody had a payer for them to leave and go to rehab or to a long-term care facility, which would actually have been cheaper, but because of the fear that we were, paying for people who should be paying for themselves. But anyway, it's very interesting. I have we're closing in on the end, and the question I would ask you would be kind of tricky, but sure. I note that you have indicated that he was involved in a violent conspiracy. I agree with you. I mean, I've never had any doubt about that. That's what I struggled with him in seminary. And I think you've made it clear that he's not shied away from it. But I think there is also a tendency now, probably among progressives, to sort of suggest that he was not at all or did not know that he was involved in this conspiracy of violence. So how did you come to your conclusions, and how do you rest on those? Because I think that's
I think they're just not.
Too.
I definitely don't support that. And I could be. It's always possible that you have missed something. But I'll just give you one example. So Bonhoeffer in 41, in the 41, spent 3 months at the Ettal Monastery, a Benedictine monastery.
Mhm.
And in doing some research here about these various decisions he made in his life, I came across where his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, who was one of the leaders of the military intelligence and really in many ways a mastermind of the conspiracy, actually came to Ettal and was meeting with some of the Catholic leaders in that monastery and from
Mhm.
around the area and meeting. Hans von Dohnanyi wasn't there to talk theology or anything like that. He was there because he wanted to talk to these people about conspiratorial efforts.
Mhm.
Bonhoeffer knew what he was getting involved in. And so to try, again, I think that it could be a little bit of a tendency to try to whitewash Bonhoeffer's
Mhm.
involvement. And he knew what he was getting into.
Yeah.
But he didn't just go right into it either. I mean,
Right.
it's a process of trying. That's why I say he's trying to find his way in a very difficult time. And so to make a hero out of him, I think there's a problem with that, making a hero out of him. I also, so we need to understand the kind of struggles and finding his way that he was going through, can learn from him a great deal, but not make a hero, but also not try to say, well, no, he wasn't really involved in this conspiracy. He didn't really know what was going on. Imagine talking to your brother-in-law,
Right. All right. Yeah. Who's in the
not
conspiracy?
really going, who's a mastermind of a conspiracy. I don't think so. That really stretches the imagination to try to imagine that.
I also think it's what makes him so human and so interesting, right? Because it'd be the same
Yeah.
struggle that we have. I know I was raised Catholic, and sometimes in January, I see you have a question here. I think that it's too easy to say a saint is a saint because what they did was so there's a demarcation, it was clearly good, right?
Yeah.
And he's more like the rest of us, where we've got to make the best decisions. Maybe he's trying to make the best decisions he can, but it he's far less interesting to me if he's very interesting to me as a man who was conflicted and did things that maybe in hindsight it'd be easy to say we shouldn't have done, but to completely say he didn't know what he was doing seems to make him too easy a figure. Now,
One
go
response,
ahead.
what I
Yeah,
think I will do is I will email, to one of these.
yeah.
I've got a copy of After 10 Years, which comes from Letters
Mhm.
and Papers from Prison. It's 16 pages.
Yeah.
He actually says in After 10 Years, just a short paragraph, that God can even take our mistakes and do something with them.
Mhm.
And so this is a guy that's aware that he's, sometimes you just may make the wrong decision, but you won't even know it's absolutely wrong. It's just the nature of some of the decisions we have to make is we make them and then we end up, you accept the consequences of that.
Right.
And yeah,
Right. January points out, as I see it, trying to name harm as love is extremely dangerous. It might be love towards people we think we're defending, but is hard, I'd assert impossible to claim it's love for the person we're harming. But this to me would be the place for confession and lament. Um, that if we feel moved to do this, we own our choice and recognize that it is a sin, fully feel the pain and suffering of it, and don't try to justify, but trust the one who judges us, which is what I see Bonhoeffer moderating.
no,
Um,
that's very well said.
yeah,
That's
I think so. And it reminds me of what I learned in studying Martin Luther King. Civil disobedience is true civil disobedience. They know they're breaking the law. They don't break the law, then pretend they didn't break the law. So the fellow who stood up with the cane during the State of the Union address, he immediately came out of the chambers and says, I'll accept whatever punishment I did. I know what I did. I think there's a tendency sometimes for people to do something and then deny they did it or that it was harmful. The integrity is insane.
one last story here
Yeah,
for you.
go ahead.
Robert Erickson was a professor at Pacific Lutheran University, specialist in Holocaust studies. He wrote a book called The Theologians Under Hitler, and there was actually a documentary made of it. A German colleague of his, while he was working on his dissertation and doing this work on theologians under Hitler, told him, when you go to Germany, you should visit my parents. They live in a small German village, and I think you'd appreciate their perspective. They were not Nazis, but but I think he'd appreciate their perspective. So he went there, sat, and they were gracious, of course, and hospitable to him. And as he tells the story, he said, we talked about the project I was working on, and the theologians under Hitler did not include Bonhoeffer, but Bonhoeffer's name came up in the course of the conversation. And when Bonhoeffer's name came up, they went silent because this is in 1969, and they still viewed Bonhoeffer as somebody who was a traitor to the German nation, even though they were not strong Nazi supporters. That's 24 years after he was executed. So
okay. Well, this has been really remarkable. I think we've all generated enough conversation to take back to our communities, whether they be faith communities or family communities. Getting a lot of thanks here.
appreciate it.
no
Take
problem.
care.